The killer cried at the funeral. He stood before 300 people, speaking in a voice everyone thought was filled with grief about brotherhood, a 15-year tradition, and the tragic accident that took his best friend. "I tried to save him," said Michael Cortland, tears streaming down his face. "God knows I tried." The widow then embraced him. She thanked him for being there in those final moments. No one suspected. No one questioned. Why would they? Best friends since high school don't kill each other for $60,000. But sometimes they do. And sometimes they stand at your funeral, shedding tears at just the right moment while your body lies in the coffin and the truth remains locked away in a tackle box for 35 years. They had gone ice fishing together every January for 15 years, same lake, same weekend. Same two friends since high school, now middle-aged men escaping wives and responsibilities for 48 hours of beer, bad jokes, and walleye. Robert Jensen and Michael Cortland, best friends, business partners, brothers in everything but blood. January 23, 1988. Robert called his wife at 3:47 p.m. to say they'd caught their limit and would be home by dinner. He never made that call again. Michael came back alone, devastated, claiming Robert had fallen through thin ice, an accident, a tragedy. 35 years later, documents hidden in Michael's tackle box would prove it was murder, premeditated, calculated, and executed on the one weekend nobody would question why two men were alone on a frozen lake. Lake Minnetonka, located just 15 miles west of Minneapolis, transforms every winter into a frozen landscape dotted with hundreds of ice fishing shelters. The lake covers 14,000 acres when liquid, but from December through March, it becomes a temporary city of anglers seeking walleye, northern pike, and perch through holes drilled in ice that can reach 3 feet thick during the coldest years. For Minnesotans, ice fishing isn't just a hobby. It's a cultural institution, a winter survival mechanism, a way to reclaim months that would otherwise be surrendered to cabin fever and seasonal depression. Robert Allen Jensen had been ice fishing since childhood, taught by his father on this very lake. By 1988, Robert was 42 years old, married to Catherine for 18 years, father to 2 teenagers, and manager of the Wayzata branch of First National Bank. He was the kind of man people described as solid, reliable, the type who coached Little League, served on the church finance committee, and never missed a mortgage payment. His dark hair was beginning to gray at the temples, his waistline had expanded slightly from too many business lunches, but he maintained the easy smile and steady demeanor that made customers trust him with their money and employees respect his leadership. Michael David Cortland was 6 months younger than Robert, though people often mistook them for the same age. They had met in sophomore year at Wayzata High School, bonding over a shared hatred of geometry class and a mutual love of fishing. Where Robert was steady and cautious, Michael was ambitious and risk-taking. Where Robert found satisfaction in middle management, Michael constantly sought the next promotion, the bigger office, the higher salary. By 1988, Michael was assistant vice president at the downtown Minneapolis headquarters of First National Bank, a position that gave him oversight responsibilities for multiple branches, including Robert's. The ice fishing tradition had started in January 1974, just 2 years after both men graduated high school. Michael had suggested it as a way to escape their girlfriends, who were pressuring them about engagement rings and wedding dates. They borrowed Michael's uncle's ice shelter, drove to Lake Minnetonka, and spent a weekend drinking cheap beer, catching walleye, and pretending they were still teenagers with no responsibilities. The trip became annual, then sacred. Marriages, children, career demands, none of it interrupted the January weekend when Robert and Michael reclaimed their youth on the frozen lake. By 1988, the tradition had evolved into a well-choreographed routine. Robert would drive from his home in Wayzata, picking up Michael at his townhouse in Edina at 6 a.m. on the designated Saturday. They would stop at Randy's bait shop for minnows and night crawlers, grab breakfast sandwiches at McDonald's, and arrive at their traditional spot on Lake Minnetonka's west arm by 8 a.m. Michael owned a proper ice shelter now, an 8x8 wooden structure painted hunter green. equipped with a propane heater, bench seating, and pre-drilled holes they could reopen each year. They would fish, drink, tell the same stories they had told for 15 years, and return home Sunday evening, refreshed by the cold air and male companionship. January 23, 1988, was a Saturday. The temperature had dropped to minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, rising only to minus 4 by morning. Fresh snow from 2 days earlier covered the lake ice in a pristine blanket that crunched under boots. Robert picked up Michael at exactly 6 a.m., both men loading their gear into Robert's Ford pickup truck. Catherine Jensen watched from the kitchen window as her husband backed out of the driveway, offering a small wave that Robert returned before disappearing down the residential street. At Randy's bait shop, the owner remembered them. Same two guys, every January, Randy Larson told investigators later. They bought 24 minnows, some waxworms. Robert asked if the fish were biting. I told him the walleye were deep, but they were hungry. They seemed in good spirits. Normal conversation. Nothing unusual. The transaction was logged at 6:47 a.m. If you're new to revealed crime cases, this isn't fiction. This is the true story of how a 15-year tradition of brotherhood and trust became the perfect cover for murder, and how a best friend's betrayal remained hidden for 3 decades, until a tackle box full of secrets finally revealed that the ice fishing accident that killed Robert Jensen was actually a carefully planned execution. Before we continue, take a second to hit that subscribe button. This channel explores America's most perplexing true crime cases, and I promise you, what happened on Lake Minnetonka and how forensic ice core analysis finally exposed the truth 35 years later will demonstrate that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of the greatest betrayal. Robert and Michael reached their traditional fishing spot at 8:15 a.m. The ice shelter sat where they had left it the previous winter, snow piled against its sides but structure intact. They spent the first hour clearing snow, reopening the augured holes, and setting up the interior. The propane heater was lit. Fishing rods were prepared with fresh line and lures. A cooler containing beer, sandwiches, and thermoses of coffee was positioned between the 2 benches. By 9:30 a.m., both men had lines in the water, and the annual ritual had officially begun. Other ice fishermen dotted the lake that morning, perhaps 40 shelters visible from their location, each separated by 100 yards or more. The etiquette of ice fishing required distance, space for each group to fish without interference. The nearest shelter to theirs belonged to Tom Hendrickson, a regular they recognized from previous years. Tom later told investigators he had seen Robert and Michael arrive, had waved in greeting, but hadn't approached or interacted with them during the day. Ice fishermen respected each other's solitude. The morning passed in the comfortable silence of old friends. They caught 3 walleye by noon, respectable for winter fishing. Michael made sandwiches around 12:30 p.m., ham and cheese on wheat bread that Catherine had prepared. They drank beer from the cooler, though not excessively. Both men had to drive home the next day and had learned through experience that hangovers in sub-zero temperatures were miserable. At 2:15 p.m., Robert caught a 4-pound walleye, the largest fish of the day. He held it up for Michael to admire before adding it to their bucket. "Catherine's going to want me to clean these tonight," Robert said, examining their catch. "We've got 6 good ones. That's our limit right there." Michael agreed they had caught enough, but suggested staying until dinner time, enjoying the solitude a while longer. At 3:47 p.m., Robert used the shelter's battery-powered radio phone, a new technology he had installed that year, to call home. Catherine answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey, honey, it's me," Robert said, his voice cheerful. "We caught our limit. 6 nice walleye. I'll probably be home around 9 tonight. Michael wants to stay for dinner, watch the sunset. I'll clean the fish when I get home." Catherine told him to drive safely, to watch for black ice on the roads. Robert promised he would, told her he loved her, and ended the call at 3:49 p.m. That 2-minute conversation would be the last time Catherine heard her husband's voice. What happened in the hours between 3:49 p.m. and 9:23 p.m. would be reconstructed later through Michael Cortland's statement, a statement that seemed completely credible in 1988, but would be proven false 35 years later. According to Michael, they continued fishing through the late afternoon. Around 6:30 p.m., as daylight faded, Robert had stepped outside the shelter to check his tip-ups, secondary fishing lines set through additional holes in the ice. Michael heard a sound, a crack or splash. He rushed outside to find Robert in the water, having fallen through what appeared to be thin ice. Michael claimed he tried to pull Robert out, but the water was too cold, the hole too unstable. Robert went under before Michael could save him. At 9:23 p.m., Michael Cortland's vehicle pulled into the parking lot of the Hennepin County Sheriff's substation in Wayzata. He stumbled into the building, his clothes wet and partially frozen, his face a mask of shock and grief. "My friend fell through the ice," he told Deputy Scott Morrison, his voice breaking. "I tried to get him out. I couldn't save him. God help me. I couldn't save him." Deputy Morrison immediately radioed for emergency response. Within 20 minutes, the Hennepin County Water Patrol and Fire Department dive team were en route to Lake Minnetonka. Michael led them back to the ice shelter, riding in a patrol vehicle because he was too shaken to drive. The scene they found appeared to support Michael's account. The ice shelter stood intact, heater still burning. Inside, 2 coffee cups sat on the bench, fishing gear stored neatly. Outside, approximately 30 feet from the shelter, was a hole in the ice roughly 18 inches in diameter. The edges were jagged, the water beneath black and forbidding. At 10:47 p.m., divers recovered Robert Jensen's body from 14 feet of water, approximately 20 feet from the hole. His body temperature indicated he had been in the water for several hours. His face was pale, lips blue, eyes open and unseeing. Robert Allen Jensen, devoted husband, loving father, respected bank manager, and loyal friend, was dead at 42. And the only person who knew what really happened in those final hours was the best friend now sobbing beside the rescue vehicles, wrapped in a thermal blanket, telling investigators how he had tried desperately to save a man he had actually murdered. The investigation into Robert Jensen's death began in the pre-dawn hours of January 24, 1988, under the jurisdiction of the Hennepin County Sheriff's Department and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Deputy Morrison, who had taken Michael Cortland's initial report, coordinated with DNR Conservation Officer Dale Kruger, whose expertise in ice fishing accidents made him the logical lead on what appeared to be a tragic but straightforward case. Minnesota averaged 15 to 20 ice fishing deaths per winter, most of them following a predictable pattern: alcohol consumption, inadequate safety precautions, venturing onto ice too thin to support human weight, or falling through pressure, cracks invisible under snow cover. Michael Cortland's formal statement was taken at 11:45 p.m. on January 23rd, after Robert's body had been recovered. Michael sat in an interview room at the sheriff's substation, still wearing the damp clothes from his rescue attempt, his hands shaking as he held a cup of coffee someone had brought him. Deputy Morrison and Officer Kruger conducted the interview, their questions gentle, their demeanor sympathetic. Nobody suspected Michael of anything except being a traumatized witness to his best friend's death. Michael's account was detailed and consistent, the mark of either truth or careful preparation. He and Robert had been fishing since morning, he explained. They had caught their limit of walleye by mid-afternoon. Robert had called his wife around 3:45 p.m. to let her know they would be heading home after dinner. They had continued fishing, talking, enjoying the peace that came from being away from daily responsibilities. Around 6:30 p.m., as twilight descended, Robert had mentioned checking the tip-ups, secondary fishing lines they had set through additional holes outside the main shelter. Robert stepped outside, Michael said, his voice hoarse with emotion or cold or both. I stayed in the shelter, drinking coffee, watching my line. Maybe 5 minutes passed. Then I heard something, a sound like ice cracking, then a splash. I knew immediately something was wrong. I ran outside, and I saw the hole, and I saw Robert in the water. Michael's hands clenched around the coffee cup. He was trying to grab the edge of the ice, trying to pull himself out. I ran to him, got on my stomach to distribute my weight, reached for his hand. I grabbed his wrist. I tried to pull him up. Michael paused, his breathing rapid. But the ice around the hole was breaking. Chunks were falling into the water. Robert's coat was soaked, heavy. He was so cold already, couldn't get his arms to work right. I was pulling, but I couldn't get leverage, couldn't lift him. And then a big piece of ice broke under me and I almost went in. I scrambled back. When I looked again, Robert was gone, under the water. I waited, hoping he'd surface, but he never did. The timeline Michael provided seemed plausible. Robert had entered the water around 6:30 p.m. Michael had spent approximately 30 minutes trying to rescue him or waiting for him to resurface. He had then faced a terrible decision: stay at the scene in hopes of recovering Robert's body, or drive to get help knowing that every minute decreased the chance of survival. He chose to get help. He had driven directly to the sheriff's substation, arriving at 9:23 p.m., roughly 2.5 hours after Robert fell through the ice. "Why didn't you call for help from the shelter?" Officer Kruger asked. It was a reasonable question. Many ice shelters by 1988 were equipped with CB radios, or the new mobile phones that were becoming more common among professionals who could afford them. Michael shook his head. The radio phone Robert installed wasn't working. I don't know if the battery died or the cold affected it. I tried it when I realized Robert wasn't coming up. Nothing. I had to drive to get help. It was the only option. The investigation team returned to the ice shelter at first light on January 24th. The scene was photographed extensively, every detail documented. The shelter itself was unremarkable. Wooden walls, propane heater, 2 benches with cushions, fishing equipment stored neatly. A bucket contained 6 walleye, exactly as Michael had described. 2 coffee thermoses sat on the small table between the benches, both empty. 2 coffee cups were beside them, residue in the bottom of each cup indicating both men had been drinking coffee that evening. Outside the shelter, the investigation focused on the hole where Robert had fallen through. Officer Kruger measured it carefully, 18 inches in diameter, the exact size an ice auger would create. The edges were irregular, consistent with ice breaking away as someone struggled in the water. But something about the hole troubled Kruger, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. The location seemed odd, 30 feet from the shelter in an area where there was no obvious reason to drill a hole. Michael had mentioned tip-up, secondary fishing lines, but there were no tip-ups visible near this hole, no flags or markers indicating active fishing lines. Kruger examined the ice thickness, drilling test holes at various locations around the scene. The measurements ranged from 18 to 24 inches, depending on location. 18 inches was the minimum thickness considered safe for ice fishing, though experienced anglers preferred 20 inches or more. The variations were normal, caused by water currents, depth changes, and snow cover that insulated some areas more than others. The hole where Robert had fallen was in an area where Kruger's test drilling showed the ice to be approximately 20 inches thick. "Could someone fall through 20-inch ice?" Deputy Morrison asked. Kruger nodded slowly. "If there's a weak spot, a pressure crack, or if the ice is compromised by underwater currents or springs, yes. Ice isn't uniform. You can have solid ice and then a pocket of weakness nearby. It's rare at 20 inches, but not impossible." The explanation satisfied Morrison, who had no expertise in ice conditions and trusted Kruger's assessment. The coffee cups were collected as evidence, though nobody suspected foul play. They were simply part of documenting the scene. In 1988, toxicology testing on trace residue from cups was possible but expensive and typically reserved for obvious homicide cases. Robert Jensen's death appeared to be an accident. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of violence, no reason to suspect his best friend of murder. The cups were bagged, labeled, and stored in the evidence room, where they would remain untouched for 35 years. The autopsy was performed on January 25th by Hennepin County Medical Examiner, Dr. Patricia Walsh. Her findings were conclusive. Robert Jensen had died by drowning. His lungs contained significant water volume. His core body temperature at recovery indicated he had been in freezing water for several hours. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of trauma beyond minor bruising on his arms consistent with struggling against ice edges. His blood alcohol content was 0.04, below the legal limit, indicating moderate but not excessive drinking. The toxicology screen checked for common drugs and substances, but found nothing remarkable. The barbiturate that Michael had used to sedate Robert before pushing him through the ice went undetected, either because the test wasn't sophisticated enough or because drowning had diluted the concentration below detectable levels. Dr. Walsh's official cause of death, accidental drowning following submersion in freezing water, manner of death, accident. There was no evidence to suggest otherwise, no reason to pursue alternative theories. Robert Jensen had fallen through thin ice while checking fishing lines and drowned before his friend could rescue him. Tragic, but unfortunately common in Minnesota winters. The community of Wayzata received the news with shock and sorrow. Robert Jensen had been a fixture in the town, known by hundreds of customers at the bank, recognized at Little League games, seen at church every Sunday. His death was front-page news in the local paper. Bank manager dies in ice fishing accident. The article featured a photo of Robert from a Chamber of Commerce event, smiling in a suit and tie, and quoted Michael Cortland extensively about his friend's character, his dedication to family, and the heroic but futile rescue attempt. Michael attended the funeral on January 29th at St. Martin's Lutheran Church. Over 300 people filled the pews, with additional mourners standing in the back and gathering in the fellowship hall. Michael sat in the front row beside Catherine Jensen and her two children, 16-year-old Sarah and 14-year-old David. When the pastor invited those who wished to speak to come forward, Michael approached the pulpit, his face drawn with grief, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Robert was my best friend," Michael said, gripping the pulpit edge. "We grew up together. We went through everything together. Marriages, births of our children, career challenges, everything. Every January we took one weekend just for ourselves, to reconnect, to remember who we were before mortgages and responsibilities. This year was supposed to be our 15th annual trip. I keep thinking, if I had been faster, if I had been stronger, if I had held on tighter, maybe he'd still be here." Tears streamed down Michael's face. "I tried to save him. God knows I tried. I'll carry that moment for the rest of my life, seeing him in that water, reaching for him and not being able to pull him out." The congregation wept with Michael. Catherine reached up from her seat and squeezed his hand. After the service, dozens of people embraced Michael, thanked him for trying, told him it wasn't his fault, assured him that Robert knew his friend had done everything possible. Nobody questioned his account. Nobody suspected that the tears were for himself, for the burden of the secret he would carry, for the performance he would have to maintain for the rest of his life. The insurance payout came through in March 1988. Robert had carried a substantial life insurance policy through the bank, part of his management benefits package. The policy paid out $300,000 to Catherine Jensen, money that would support her and the children, pay for college educations, and provide financial security Robert had always prioritized. The insurance company investigated as standard procedure, reviewing the accident report, the medical examiner's findings, and Michael Cortland's statement. They found no irregularities, no red flags. The check was issued without dispute. By April 1988, the case was officially closed. The Hennepin County Sheriff's Department filed its final report. Accidental death by drowning, no evidence of foul play. Case resolved. The evidence, including the coffee cups, fishing gear, and photographs of the scene, was boxed and moved to long-term storage. Officer Kruger filed his DNR report with recommendations about ice safety education and the dangers of checking tip-ups alone in areas with variable ice thickness. Life moved forward for everyone touched by Robert Jensen's death, each person processing grief in their own way. Catherine Jensen sold the ice fishing shelter. She couldn't bear to look at it, couldn't imagine anyone from her family ever using it again. Michael Cortland offered to handle the sale, posting it in the classifieds and eventually selling it to another ice fishing enthusiast for $200. Catherine gave the money to charity. She also gave away Robert's fishing gear, his rods and tackle boxes, everything associated with the hobby that had killed him. Michael accepted one item as a keepsake, Robert's favorite fishing rod, a medium-action walleye rod they had used together for years. Catherine thought it was a touching gesture, a way for Michael to remember his friend. She didn't know that Michael kept the rod not as a memorial, but as a trophy, a reminder that he had gotten away with perfect murder. The years following Robert Jensen's death established a pattern that would persist for 3 decades. Michael Cortland became a fixture in the Jensen family's life, not as a replacement for Robert, but as a living connection to the man they had lost. He attended Sarah's high school graduation in 1989, sat in the audience as she walked across the stage to receive her diploma. He helped David learn to drive in 1990, taking the teenager to empty parking lots on weekends, patiently teaching him clutch control in Robert's old pickup truck that Catherine couldn't bear to sell. He stopped by the Jensen house on holidays, bringing gifts for the children, checking on Catherine, maintaining the role of devoted family friend who honored his best friend's memory by caring for those Robert had left behind. Catherine appreciated Michael's presence during those difficult years. Widowhood at 40 had not been part of her life plan, and the sudden absence of her partner of 18 years left a void that well-meaning friends and family couldn't fill. Michael understood Robert in ways others didn't. He could tell stories about Robert's youth, about the man Catherine had married before mortgages and parenting changed him. Michael's visits provided comfort during the first terrible year when grief was still raw and constant. What Catherine didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Michael's attention served multiple purposes. Yes, he genuinely cared about the family in his own complicated way. Robert had been his friend once, before money and desperation had transformed friendship into threat. But Michael's continued presence also allowed him to monitor the situation, to ensure no questions arose about that January evening, to maintain the narrative that Robert's death had been a tragic accident rather than calculated murder. Every visit to the Jensen house was reconnaissance disguised as compassion. Michael's career at First National Bank flourished in the years after Robert's death. The embezzlement that Robert had discovered in late 1987, the financial irregularities that had cost Robert his life, had ended with Robert's death. Michael had carefully repaid the money he had stolen, using legitimate bonuses and a small inheritance from his mother to cover the $60,000 he had siphoned from accounts over a 3-year period. The audit Robert had been preparing never materialized. The suspicions Robert had shared with Michael over coffee, giving his friend a chance to explain before reporting him, died with Robert in Lake Minnetonka's freezing water. By 1992, Michael had been promoted to vice president, overseeing commercial lending for the entire Minneapolis region. By 1996, he was senior vice president, earning a salary that allowed him to purchase a large home in Adina's prestigious country club district. His success appeared to validate his abilities, his work ethic, his value to the institution. Nobody at the bank knew that his rise had been built on Robert Jensen's silence, that every promotion was purchased with his best friend's life. Michael never married. He dated occasionally, relationships that lasted a few months before fizzling due to his emotional unavailability or his tendency to work 60-hour weeks. His colleagues assumed he was married to his career, one of those men who found fulfillment in professional achievement rather than domestic life. The truth was more complicated. Michael carried guilt, though not enough to confess. He experienced remorse, though not enough to turn himself in. The weight of what he had done created a barrier between himself and genuine intimacy. How could he let someone close when the central fact of his adult life was unspeakable? The annual ice fishing tradition died with Robert. Michael never returned to Lake Minnetonka during winter. When asked by colleagues if he still ice fished, he would shake his head, his expression pained. "Not since Robert," he would say. "I can't go back there. Too many memories." It was true in ways his colleagues couldn't understand. Michael did carry memories of that lake, But they weren't the nostalgic recollections of brotherhood and walleye. They were memories of drilling that hole 30 feet from the shelter, of crushing sedatives and stirring them into Robert's coffee thermos, of waiting for his friend to lose consciousness, of dragging Robert's limp body across the ice and pushing him through the hole into water that would preserve the appearance of accidental drowning. In 1995, Robert Jensen met Gordon Wheeler, a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. They were introduced by mutual friends at a church social, two people in their 40s navigating the complexities of building new relationships while honoring past marriages. They dated for a year, cautiously, both aware of their children's feelings and their own complicated grief. When Gordon proposed in December 1995, Catherine said yes, and Michael was among the first people she called to share the news. "Robert would be happy for you," Michael told her over the phone, his voice warm with what sounded like genuine emotion. "You deserve this. The kids deserve this. Gordon's a good man." He meant it, to whatever extent Michael was capable of sincerity. Catherine's remarriage meant the Jensen family was moving forward, leaving behind the tragedy that had defined them. For Michael, it meant one less reason for Catherine to dwell on Robert's death, one less opportunity for questions to arise about that January evening 8 years earlier. Michael attended Catherine and Gordon's wedding in April 1996, sitting near the back of St. Martin's Lutheran Church, the same church where he had eulogized Robert 8 years before. He watched Catherine walk down the aisle in a simple cream-colored dress, watched her face shine with cautious happiness, watched her children serve as witnesses to their mother's second chance at love. After the ceremony, Michael congratulated the couple, shook Gordon's hand, told him he was getting an exceptional woman. Catherine hugged Michael, thanked him for being there, for supporting her through everything. Michael smiled and said that's what Robert would have wanted. The years accumulated. Sarah graduated from the University of Minnesota in 1993, moved to Chicago for a marketing job, married a man she met through work. David graduated in 1996, became a high school teacher, eventually took a position at Wayzata High School, where his father and Michael had attended decades earlier. Catherine thrived in her second marriage, finding joy she hadn't expected to feel again. The tragedy of Robert's death became family history rather than daily reality, a sad chapter that shaped them but no longer defined them. Michael's life followed its own trajectory. Promotions continued, his salary grew. He collected vintage cars, traveled to Europe, invested in real estate. He appeared successful by any external measure, but those who knew him well noticed peculiarities. He was generous with charity but had few close friends. He attended social events but left early. He achieved every professional goal but seemed perpetually unsatisfied. A therapist he saw briefly in 2002 suggested he was experiencing complicated grief over his friend's death, never fully processing the trauma of witnessing Robert's drowning and his inability to prevent it. Michael agreed this might be true and stopped seeing the therapist. So here's something I'm curious about. What's the weather like where you're watching from today? Our story takes place in the brutal cold of a Minnesota winter, where temperatures well below zero create ice, thick enough to support trucks and ice fishing shelters. Weather plays a crucial role in this case, in the ice conditions that were supposed to explain Robert's death, and in the ice core science that would eventually expose the truth. Drop your location and current weather in the comments. It's fascinating to connect with viewers experiencing everything from tropical heat to winter storms, all drawn to these stories of justice that sometimes takes decades to arrive. The evidence from January 1988 remained in storage, cataloged and preserved but forgotten. The coffee cups, carefully bagged and labeled, sat in a climate-controlled evidence room in the basement of the Hennepin County Sheriff's Department. The case file, marked "Closed Accidental Death," was boxed and archived. The photographs of the ice fishing shelter, the hole in the ice, the scene where Robert Jensen had supposedly fallen through, were stored on microfilm, technology that was already becoming obsolete by the mid-1990s. Officer Dale Kruger retired from the Minnesota DNR in 2005, his career spanning 32 years of investigating hunting accidents, fishing violations, and ice-related incidents. He had worked dozens of ice fishing deaths, but Robert Jensen's case occasionally troubled him during quiet moments. Something about that hole, 30 feet from the shelter, in ice that Kruger had measured at 20 inches thick, had never quite made sense. But without evidence of foul play, without any reason to suspect murder, Kruger had filed his report and moved on to the next case. He died in 2018, never knowing that his instincts had been correct, that the accident he had investigated was actually Minnesota's most patient murder. Michael Cortland turned 60 in 2006, marking the milestone with a celebration at an expensive Minneapolis restaurant, surrounded by colleagues and professional associates. No family attended. Michael's parents had died years earlier, and he had no siblings, no children, no wife. The people who knew him best were work relationships, surface-level friendships built on professional respect rather than personal intimacy. If anyone at that dinner party had asked Michael about his deepest regret, he would have said not having a family of his own. He would not have mentioned Robert Jensen, the friend he had murdered to cover up embezzlement, the man whose death had allowed Michael to build the successful life he was celebrating. Catherine Jensen Wheeler, as she now was, rarely thought about the specific details of Robert's death anymore. The pain had dulled to a permanent ache, manageable, integrated into who she had become. She thought of Robert when Sarah's children, his grandchildren he would never meet, did something that reminded her of him. She thought of Robert on anniversaries and at family gatherings where his absence was notable. But the actual circumstances of his death, the ice fishing accident that had taken him, had become abstract. He had drowned. His best friend had tried to save him. That was the story Catherine knew, the story she had told their children, the story that had shaped their understanding of loss and resilience. By 2020, 32 years after Robert's death, Michael Cortland was 74 years old, retired from banking, living comfortably on his pension and investments. His health was declining. Diabetes, diagnosed in 2015, was poorly controlled. Heart disease, a family legacy, was managed with multiple medications. He had difficulty walking long distances, shortness of breath from minimal exertion. His doctor suggested his time was limited, perhaps 5 years, perhaps less. Michael faced mortality with the same emotional distance he had maintained throughout his adult life. In the summer of 2022, Michael's health took a dramatic downturn. A mild heart attack in June was followed by congestive heart failure in August. He was hospitalized 3 times between August and November, each stay longer than the last. His doctors discussed end-of-life care, suggested hospice might be appropriate. Michael refused. He wanted to die at home, in the house he had purchased with money earned after Robert's death, surrounded by possessions that represented a life built on a foundation of murder. On December 3, 2022, Michael Cortland suffered a massive heart attack while watching television in his living room. He was alone, as he had been alone for most of his adult life. Emergency services arrived within 12 minutes, but Michael was already gone. He died at 77, 34 years, 10 months, and 10 days after killing his best friend. And in dying, he left behind evidence he had kept hidden for over 3 decades, evidence that would finally expose the truth he had guarded so carefully. Michael Cortland's adult children, Jennifer and Daniel, arrived at their father's Adena house on December 4, 2022, the day after his death. Neither had been particularly close to Michael in recent years. Jennifer, 42, lived in Seattle with her family, visited Minnesota perhaps twice a year out of obligation rather than affection. Daniel, 39, lived in Minneapolis but saw his father mainly at holidays, their relationship cordial but distant. Both had grown up with a father who was physically present but emotionally absent, a man who provided financially but never connected deeply, who attended school events but always seemed preoccupied with something unspeakable. The house reflected Michael's solitary existence. Expensive furniture arranged without warmth, a kitchen clearly unused except for morning coffee, bedrooms serving as storage for the accumulation of a 77-year life. Jennifer and Daniel faced the overwhelming task of sorting through decades of possessions, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to discard. Michael had left minimal instructions, his will simply dividing his estate equally between his children without guidance about personal effects or sentimental items. They started in the logical places: the office, the bedroom, the living areas. Michael's professional life was meticulously documented, files organized by year and category, tax returns dating back to the 1970s. His personal life was sparse. Few photographs, mostly of Jennifer and Daniel as children. No love letters, no journals, no evidence of the interior life that everyone possesses, but Michael had apparently kept locked away. Jennifer found the organized emptiness depressing. "Did Dad have any close friends?" she asked Daniel as they sorted through a closet of expensive suits Michael would never wear again. Daniel shook his head. "I don't think so. There were guys from work, but after he retired, I don't know that he talked to anyone regularly. He seemed okay with being alone." They worked in silence for a while, the weight of their father's isolated existence settling over them like the December cold that seeped through the windows. On December 7th, they moved to the basement, a finished space Michael had used primarily for storage. Boxes were stacked along the walls, labeled in Michael's precise handwriting: tax records 1985, 1990, old sporting equipment, files Miss C. Jennifer tackled the boxes methodically while Daniel examined items that didn't fit in containers: an old bicycle, a stack of vintage license plates, camping equipment that looked decades old. In the far corner, behind a stack of boxes containing Christmas decorations that Michael had apparently saved but never used, Daniel found an old tackle box. It was green metal, scratched and dented, the kind that had been popular in the 1980s before plastic models dominated the market. He opened it, expecting to find fishing lures and line, perhaps some sentimental value if it had belonged to his grandfather. The top tray contained exactly what Daniel expected: rusty hooks, tangled line, lures that had seen better days. But when he lifted the tray to examine the bottom compartment, he found something unexpected: documents. A manila folder, water-stained around the edges, filled with papers that had nothing to do with fishing. Daniel pulled out the folder and opened it on the basement floor. The first document was a bank audit report dated November 1987, stamped First National Bank, internal use only. The report detailed financial irregularities in commercial lending accounts, systematic discrepancies totaling approximately $60,000 over a 36-month period. Highlighted passages identified account manager M. Cortland as the common factor in the suspicious transactions. Handwritten notes in the margins in Michael's distinctive script read, "Robert found this, and November 30th, Robert wants to discuss." Daniel's hands shook as he flipped through additional pages. Bank statements, ledgers, documentation of funds transferred and repaid. A timeline written in Michael's handwriting, tracking money in and out of accounts. And at the bottom of the folder, a letter written on lined notebook paper, the ink slightly faded but still legible, addressed, "To whom it may find this." Daniel read the first paragraph and felt his world tilt. "Jennifer," he called up the basement stairs, his voice strange even to himself. "You need to come down here, right now." Jennifer descended the stairs to find her brother sitting on the concrete floor, papers spread around him, his face white with shock. "What is it?" she asked, and Daniel handed her the letter. Jennifer read silently, and Daniel watched as her expression moved through confusion, disbelief, and finally horror. The letter was dated January 15th, 2022, less than a year before Michael's death. It was a confession, though it never used that word. Michael wrote in the careful, precise language that had characterized his professional communications, but the content was devastating. "I have lived with this secret for 34 years. Robert Jensen was my best friend, and I killed him on January 23rd, 1988, not in anger, not in passion, but in cold premeditation because he discovered I had been stealing from the bank and was going to report me. I couldn't let that happen. I had debts, gambling debts that would have ruined me if exposed. The embezzlement was supposed to be temporary, money I would repay before anyone noticed. But Robert was thorough. He found the irregularities. He confronted me in November 1987, gave me a chance to explain. I told him I would make it right, begged him not to report it. He gave me until after the holidays, said we'd discuss it during our January ice fishing trip, decide together how to handle it. Robert thought he was being a good friend, giving me time to figure out a solution. He didn't realize he was giving me time to plan his murder. The letter continued for 3 handwritten pages, detailing how Michael had researched sedatives, settled on secobarbital because it was tasteless and acted quickly, how he had crushed pills and added them to Robert's coffee thermos before they left for the lake, how he had drilled a hole in the ice 30 feet from their shelter while Robert was unconscious, then dragged his friend's body and pushed him through into water that would mask the drug in his system, how he had waited an appropriate amount of time before driving to report the accident, how he had maintained the performance of grief for 34 years, attending Robert's funeral, supporting his family, rising through the ranks at the bank on the foundation of his best friend's silence. I am writing this in my 77th year, my health failing, death approaching. I do not expect forgiveness, do not deserve it. I killed Robert Jensen for $60,000 and my own cowardice. Catherine deserves to know the truth. Sarah and David deserve to know their father didn't die because of careless ice or bad luck. He died because I chose my reputation over his life. If anyone finds this after my death, please deliver it to the authorities. This is my confession. Make of it what you will. Jennifer finished reading and looked at Daniel, her eyes filled with tears that weren't for their father. He murdered his best friend, she whispered. Dad was a murderer. And he kept this hidden in a tackle box for 34 years? Daniel examined the folder's other contents more carefully. Among the financial documents was a business card for Robert Jensen, Wayzata branch manager, with a photo showing a friendly man in his 40s. This is the guy he killed, Daniel said, studying the photo. Dad's best friend. They went ice fishing every year. I remember Dad mentioning Robert when I was a kid, how they used to fish together, how Robert died in an accident. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. The siblings sat in their father's basement for over an hour, reading and rereading the confession, trying to reconcile the father they had known with the murderer who had written these words. Finally, Jennifer made the decision that would reopen a case that had been closed for 35 years. We have to take this to the police, she said. Robert Jensen's family deserves the truth. It doesn't matter that Dad's dead. They deserve to know what really happened. On December 9, 2022, Jennifer and Daniel Cortland walked into the Hennepin County Sheriff's Department with the tackle box, the confession letter, and the supporting documents. They were directed to Detective Sarah Chen, who led the newly established cold case unit. Chen had been reviewing unsolved cases from the 1980s and 1990s, applying modern forensic techniques to evidence that had been collected, but never fully analyzed. She listened to the Cortland siblings' story with growing astonishment. Your father confessed to a murder from 1988? Chen asked, examining the letter carefully. And you found this hidden in a tackle box? She read Michael's confession twice, then pulled up the archived case file on Robert Jensen. The file was extensive. Photographs and reports from the original investigation, Michael Cortland's witness statement, the medical examiner's findings. Everything pointed to accidental death. Nothing suggested murder. Until now. Chen spent the following week reviewing every document from the 1988 investigation. She consulted with forensic experts, cold case specialists, and legal advisors. The confession was compelling, but Michael Cortland was dead. There could be no prosecution, no trial, no justice in the traditional sense, but there could be truth. Catherine Jensen Wheeler, now 74 years old, deserved to know what had actually happened to her first husband. The children Robert had left behind deserved answers. The coffee cups collected in 1988 were still in evidence storage, preserved in sealed bags for 35 years. Chen arranged for them to be tested using 2023 forensic technology that could detect trace substances invisible to 1988 analysis. The results came back in January 2023, secobarbital residue in the cup that had Robert Jensen's fingerprints. The drug concentration was minute after 35 years, but modern mass spectrometry could identify it definitively. Robert had been drugged before he went into the water. Chen also consulted with Dr. James Halverson, a forensic glaciologist at the University of Minnesota, who specialized in ice core analysis and historical climate data. "Can you tell me how thick the ice was on Lake Minnetonka on January 23, 1988? Chen asked. Halverson was intrigued by the question. Ice thickness data for that period existed, collected by the DNR and university researchers studying freeze-thaw cycles. Halverson spent 2 weeks analyzing historical records, temperature data, and ice core samples that had been preserved for climate research. His conclusion was unambiguous. On January 23, 1988, the ice on Lake Minnetonka's west arm, where Robert Jensen had supposedly fallen through thin ice, was between 20 and 24 inches thick. It would be virtually impossible for someone to accidentally fall through ice that thick, Halverson told Chen. That's thick enough to support vehicles. For someone to go through that ice, the hole would have to be deliberately cut, and the person would have to be pushed or placed in the water. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. Detective Sarah Chen sat in her office on February 3, 2023, staring at the phone number she had written on a notepad. Catherine Jensen Wheeler, 74 years old. Living in Wayzata, the same town where she had raised her children, where her first husband had managed a bank branch, where she had rebuilt her life after tragedy. Chen had made difficult phone calls throughout her career, notifications that changed lives irreversibly. This call would be among the hardest. Catherine answered on the third ring, her voice bright and unsuspecting. "Hello?" Chen identified herself, explained she was a detective with the Hennepin County Sheriff's Department Cold Case Unit, and asked if they could meet in person to discuss Robert Jensen. There was a long pause. "Robert?" Catherine said finally. "But that was so long ago, 35 years. Why would you want to discuss Robert now?" "We've received new information about his death," Chen said carefully. "Information that requires a conversation in person. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you? I can come to your home, or we can meet at the station, whatever you prefer." Catherine chose her home. Chen heard the tremor in her voice, the fear that comes from knowing that something you believed for decades might be wrong. Chen arrived at the Wheeler residence on February 4th at 2 p.m. The house was a modest 2-story in a tree-lined neighborhood, the kind of home built for families who valued stability over showiness. Gordon Wheeler answered the door, introduced himself as Catherine's husband, led Chen to the living room where Catherine sat on a sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been beautiful once, Chen could see, and remained striking with silver hair and clear blue eyes. But those eyes held anxiety now, the look of someone bracing for impact. Chen sat across from Catherine and spoke as gently as the truth would allow. "Mrs. Wheeler, I need to tell you something about your first husband's death. I know this will be difficult to hear. Robert didn't die in an accident. He was murdered. Michael Cortland drugged him, drilled a hole in the ice, and pushed him through. We have Michael's written confession, forensic evidence that confirms Robert was sedated, and ice core analysis proving the ice was too thick for accidental breakthrough. I'm so sorry. The man you trusted, the man who comforted you after Robert's death, was the person who killed him." The color drained from Catherine's face. Gordon moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. She didn't speak for nearly a minute, processing information that rewrote 35 years of understanding. When she finally found words, they came slowly, carefully. "Michael killed Robert. Michael confessed to this. When?" Chen explained about Michael's death in December, about his children finding the tackle box with the confession and financial documents, about the embezzlement Robert had discovered, about the premeditated nature of the murder. She showed Catherine photographs of the confession letter, though she didn't give her the original. Catherine read Michael's words, her expression moving through disbelief, anger, and finally a grief that seemed fresh despite the decades. "He was at the funeral," Catherine said, her voice hollow. "He spoke at the funeral. He cried. I hugged him. I thanked him for trying to save Robert. He helped with David's driving lessons. He came to my wedding when I married Gordon. All of that time he knew. He knew what he'd done, and he stood beside me, pretending to grieve, pretending to care. She looked at Chen with eyes that had seen too much. Why? Why would he do that? Chen explained what she understood from the confession and the evidence. Michael had needed to monitor the situation to ensure no questions arose about Robert's death. His presence in the Jensen family's life wasn't entirely cynical. He had genuinely cared for them in his complicated way. But primarily, his involvement allowed him to control the narrative, to maintain his alibi, to live with what he'd done by performing ongoing penance that cost him nothing except the discomfort of proximity to his crime. Catherine absorbed this information with the resilience of someone who had survived one devastating loss and would now survive another. "What happens now?" she asked. "Michael is dead. There can't be a trial. Is there any justice in this?" Chen explained that while Michael couldn't be prosecuted, the case would be officially reclassified as murder. Robert's death certificate could be amended to reflect homicide rather than accident. The truth would be public record. And perhaps most importantly, Catherine and her children would finally know that Robert hadn't died because of carelessness or bad luck. He had died because he was honest, because he confronted a friend rather than reporting him immediately, because he believed in giving people second chances. Robert died because he was a good man, Chen said. That's not justice, but it's truth. And sometimes truth is all we can deliver. In the weeks that followed, Detective Chen held a press conference announcing the resolution of the Robert Jensen case. The story made national news. Bank manager's ice fishing death revealed his murder 35 years later. The forensic aspects fascinated media outlets and true crime communities. How had secobarbital been detected in coffee cup residue after 35 years? How did ice core analysis prove the ice had been too thick for accidental breakthrough? Dr. James Halverson gave interviews explaining glaciology and how historical climate data could reconstruct precise ice conditions from decades past. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner amended Robert Jensen's death certificate in March 2023. Cause of death: homicide by drowning, with contributing factor of sedative poisoning. Manner of death: murder. The change was bureaucratic, but symbolically powerful. Robert's death was no longer classified as an accident. The record now reflected reality. Catherine's children, Sarah and David, now in their 50s, struggled with the revelation in different ways. Sarah, who had been 16 when her father died, remembered Michael Cortland clearly. She had trusted him, had appreciated his presence during her mother's grieving process. Learning that he had murdered her father, that every kind gesture had been performance, filled her with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. "I hugged my father's murderer," she told a therapist. "I called him Uncle Mike. I thought he was family." David, who had been 14 when Robert died, experienced the revelation as both devastating and clarifying. He had always sensed something off about Michael Cortland, an emotional distance that David had attributed to Michael's personality. "I never liked him," David admitted to his sister. "I couldn't have told you why. But something about him always felt wrong. Now I know why. He was carrying the guilt of killing Dad. That changes a person, makes them hollow." The community of Wayzata grappled with its own complicated feelings. Michael Cortland had been a respected figure, a successful banker, a generous contributor to local charities. People who had known him for decades now faced the reality that he had been a murderer who had hidden in plain sight for 35 years. Some defended him, argued that one terrible act shouldn't define a lifetime. Others felt betrayed, questioning how they had missed the signs, wondering what other secrets might be lurking beneath Wayzata's pleasant surface. First National Bank, which had become part of a larger regional institution through mergers, issued a statement expressing sorrow for the Jensen family and noting that the 1987 embezzlement had occurred under different management with inadequate oversight controls. They established a scholarship in Robert Jensen's name for children of bank employees pursuing higher education, a gesture that Catherine appreciated, even as she recognized it as corporate damage control. If Robert's story has moved you, If it's reminded you that the truth can surface even after decades of deception, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support enables us to continue bringing attention to cold cases like Robert's, cases where families waited years for answers that modern forensic science and determined investigators finally delivered. Share this video with someone who appreciates how ice core analysis and trace toxicology can combine to expose secrets someone thought would remain buried forever. Leave a comment about what aspect of this case impacted you most deeply. Building this community of viewers who care about cold case justice creates awareness that makes a real difference for families still waiting for answers. Catherine Jensen. Wheeler requested that Robert's remains be exhumed and reinterred in a family cemetery plot with an updated headstone. The original marker had read, Robert Allen Jensen, 1945-1988, beloved husband and father, taken too soon. The new headstone, installed in May 2023, reads, Robert Allen Jensen, 1945-1988, beloved husband and father, murdered by the friend he trusted, finally at peace. Catherine wanted the truth visible, wanted anyone who visited the grave to know that Robert hadn't died in an accident. He had been betrayed in the worst possible way, and that deserved acknowledgement. The tackle box that had contained Michael's confession and the incriminating documents was donated to the Minnesota Historical Society, where it became part of an exhibit on cold case resolution through forensic advancement. Visitors to the exhibit can see the actual tackle box, read excerpts from Michael's confession, and learn about ice core analysis and trace toxicology. The exhibit is titled Secrets Kept, Truths Revealed, How Science Solves Cold Cases. Robert Jensen's case is the centerpiece, demonstrating how evidence preserved for decades can finally speak when technology catches up. Michael Cortland's estate, valued at approximately $1.2 million after the sale of his house and liquidation of investments, was divided between his children as specified in his will. Jennifer and Daniel Cortland wrestled with whether to accept the inheritance, money that had been built on the foundation of their father's crime. After consultation with therapists and attorneys, they accepted the inheritance but donated a significant portion to causes supporting families of murder victims and forensic science research. We can't undo what our father did, Jennifer explained to a reporter, but we can try to ensure that other families don't wait 35 years for truth. Dr. James Halverson's ice core analysis methodology, refined through the Jensen case, was adopted by law enforcement agencies across the northern United States. Several other cold cases involving supposed ice fishing accidents were reopened and re-examined using Halverson's techniques. In Wisconsin, a 1995 case initially ruled accidental was reclassified as murder after ice thickness analysis proved the victim couldn't have fallen through ice that was 26 inches thick. In Michigan, a 2001 drowning was revealed as homicide when historical temperature data showed the ice had been far too solid for accidental breakthrough. Robert Jensen's death became a catalyst for justice in cases beyond his own. Catherine Jensen Wheeler lived to see the truth about her first husband's death, but she didn't live long to carry that knowledge. She died peacefully in her sleep on August 17, 2023, 6 months after learning that Robert had been murdered. She was 74. Her obituary, written by her children, noted that she was finally reunited with her first husband, Robert, whose truth she fought to preserve and whose memory she honored through decades of not knowing. Gordon Wheeler told friends that Catherine had achieved a form of peace in her final months, the peace that comes from understanding rather than wondering. The case of Robert Jensen reminds us that some betrayals are so profound that they reverberate across decades. Michael Cortland lived 51 years after high school, 34 of those years carrying the secret of murdering his best friend. He achieved professional success, accumulated wealth, maintained a facade of normalcy. But he never married, never formed deep connections, never allowed anyone to know him fully. The murder he committed for $60,000 and self-preservation cost him not just his soul, but his capacity for genuine human connection. Robert Jensen died at 42. his life stolen by someone he trusted completely. But 35 years later, forensic science gave Robert a voice. The ice remembered how thick it had been that January evening. The coffee cup remembered the drug that had put Robert to sleep before he was pushed to his death. And Michael's conscience, dormant for decades, finally spoke through a confession hidden in a tackle box that his children would find after he was gone. Justice delayed 35 years, but justice nonetheless. For Robert, for Catherine, for everyone who believes that truth matters even when the guilty are beyond punishment. The ice kept its secrets for more than 3 decades, but ice has memory. And science, patient and persistent, eventually reads what ice remembers. Some friendships are sacred, some betrayals are unforgivable, and some truths, no matter how long they're buried, eventually surface into light.